Chapter 13. Central Bomber Establishment R.A.F. Marham and Central Flying School. R.A.F. Marham lies some 10 miles to the southeast of the market town of Kings Lynn in Norfolk on rolling fertile land. North of the Fen districts, the camp and airfield were built prior to World War II. When I was there, quite close to the present airfield were still some old buildings from the site of an RFC airfield in the First World War. The area, therefore, has a long history in military aviation. Originally, a grass airfield, runways had been constructed in 1945. The airfield had undergone major reconstruction with extended runways. The original plan, which applied to 3 airfields, was to build them up to take longer-range bombers in the American Superfortress 829 range. The war ended before this happened and the decision was made to establish the Central Bomber Establishment there. CBE comprised 2 wings, a tactics wing, staffed by experienced bomber pilots of senior rank who would teach and develop future bomber tactics. Development wing took over BDU and its tasks as the tester and developer of new bomber aircraft equipment. The base was commanded by Air Commodore Cocky Spencer. Tactics wing was commanded by Group Captain Samuel Worthy, who later became First Chief of Air Staff, and subsequently Chief of Defense Staff and reached the rank of Marshal of the Royal Air Force. His present title in 1993 is Lord Worthy of Timaru, the town where he was born in New Zealand. He is also one of the most decorated of all New Zealanders and a magnificent person in every way. He was certainly one of the finest officers I have ever had the honor and privilege to serve under, combining bravery, brains and bearing. Development wing was commanded by Group Captain Jack Simpson, another fine officer of cavalry-like military bearing, who later became Air Commodore. It was in early December, 1945, that our move to Marham took place, and it was great to begin our flying there as part of CBE from such a magnificent new airfield, but able to enjoy the excellent facilities of a pre-war camp. We now were losing the Halifaxes and were to be equipped mainly with Lancasters. At this stage we also had the 1st Lincoln and Bomber Command. A few liaison aircraft in the form of an Astor, Anson, Oxford and Proctor made up the total complement. Shortly after arrival we also acquired a de Havilland Mosquito B-16. CBE continued to carry out the same sort of trials as we had done at BDU, with one new trial which involved working with Spitfires from Central Fighter Establishment from nearby R.A.F. West Raynham, a unit performing a similar task as ours, but on fighter aircraft. The trial was known as defensive bomber aircraft, with various types of new equipment for defense against the mock attacks made by Spitfires off CFE. CFE was staffed by a number of famous R.A.F. fighter pilots, including Air Commodore Bird Wilson, Wing Commander Stanford Tuck of Battle of Britain fame, and Squadron Leader John Derry, who became a famous test pilot and was tragically killed at the disastrous crash which has also killed many civilians on the ground at the Farnborough Air Show. We were able to meet these famous pilots both at work and socially. In March, a special detachment of the United States Air Force arrived to carry out a test program named Project Ruby. The commander was Colonel Daniel Hoare, who brought a large team with 3 B-29 Super Fortresses and 6 B-17 Flying Fortresses. Their task included dropping various types of bombs on the old German U-boat submarine shelters at Farge near Bremen in Germany. Amongst the weapons they were to drop were the R.A.F. 22,000 pounds Grand Slam bomb. We soon had an enjoyable liaison going with the Americans, and we were both given the opportunity to fly in one another's aircraft. It was also very interesting to swap experiences with those of the American crew members who had flown B-29s against the Japanese in the Pacific. I was privileged to go on one mission to drop a 22,000 pound bomb. We flew to Farge, and I remember the sensation as the huge bomb was released, caused by the sudden drop in weight, and the equally quick rise in height of almost 500 feet. We turned quickly and were able to watch the large bomb drop all the way down and see the vivid flash as it hit the target. The B-17 aircraft were dropping 4,000 pounds bombs with rocket-assisted mechanism designed to increase the thermal velocity of the bomb, thereby giving the weapon greater penetrating force to pierce the concrete defenses of the U-boat shelters. The Americans in their inimitable way christened their Project Ruby, Project Booby. They stayed with us for 3 months and we were sorry to see them go. Naturally, they were also missed by quite a few of the local ladies. The Yanks had to tactfully be made aware early in the project that it was not customary for ladies to visit the male living quarters on R.A.F. bases, other than to the more public rooms on base. During this time I formed a very good friendship with the Boeing Aircraft Company engineering representative named Fred Baker, a delightful and modest man. He came and stayed at my family home in London, and for some years after we kept in touch. Following all the excitement of the American visit, we settled down to a quieter life. However, life for me was not devoid of excitement, but not the sort you need. I was afforded the chance to fly a Mosquito for the first time. Unfortunately, we had no dual control, and when I came into land I found the much faster approach speed of the Mossy a bit overwhelming. I bounced badly on landing and, subsequently, ground looped the aircraft, writing it off. Luckily, Freddie Ramsey, the other pilot, and I were not hurt, but one George Bates was very red-faced for a spell. It really showed that a conversion to a much faster aircraft really needed to be done in a dual-controlled aircraft. Later on, at another unit, I did learn to fly the Mosquito successfully, in a dual version of the aircraft. Life in the R.A.F. continued to develop into a more peacetime pattern, with a more formal social life, including mess life with regular dining in nights. We also began to do more parades and to work a week which normally finished at Saturday lunchtime, enabling us to be free until Monday morning, unless something special was on. The weekend break was not enough to travel to Gladys and Valerie in Carnarvon, but I could get down to London and stay with my mother and brother. I began playing sport regularly and became officer in charge of station soccer. As full-time station sports officers were being demobbed, I acquired that task as well. The peacetime practice of aircrew officers taking on secondary duties of this nature had been reintroduced, and I found this very interesting work. Marham also had a large number of German prisoners of war, with considerable technical skills, who were employed on the base. On one occasion we actually played a soccer match against them. Amongst them were a number of first-class workmen with skills that were very much appreciated in the various basic trade workshops such as motor transport and station services. They were quite pleased to be employed whilst awaiting repatriation to Germany. Several other interesting activities went on, including the first Battle of Britain open day and air display. For the first time since the war, R.A.F. stations were open to the public for the whole day. I took part in the air display flying a Lancaster and an Anson. Another interesting trip I had was to fly with the former master bomber, squadron leader Charles Owen, DSO, DFC. A young officer full of vitality and fun with over 60 bomber ops to his credit. We carried out a live bombing trip in a Lancaster to Heligoland and the Baltic, finishing up with another Baedeker type of tour of Germany. I also went with Charles to take the first Lincoln to visit the R.A.F. College at Cranwell, then commanded by one of the famous R.A.F. characters, Air Commodore Richard Atcherley. He was one of two identical twin brothers who confused everybody wherever they appeared, as to who was Richard and who was David. One holiday I had the opportunity to visit Nuremberg when the famous war crime trials were on. This visit enabled me in 1946 to see for the first time on the ground the devastation to this famous German city, former center of Nazi culture. I remember very clearly the stench of death still in the air, caused by the bulldozing of buildings covering the dead bodies known to be left below ground. I got the lift back in Field Marshal Montgomery's personal aircraft, although the renowned general was not on board. The fact that he was not had an amusing sequel, for when we landed at Croydon Airport, a crowd had gathered to see if he was present, but out stepped one Flight Lieutenant George Bates. On that occasion the senior passenger. The winter of 1946-47 was one of the severest on record, aggravated by a serious shortage of coal which could not be transported from the frozen coal yards. The result was that Marham and many other R.A.F. stations were temporarily closed, apart from a skeleton staff of essential personnel. Gladys was now staying in London with my mother and had Valerie with her. Those of us who were not required were sent on indefinite leave until stations could get back to normal operations. Firstly, we were sent on leave for a week, and then each week after, we received a telegram to extend our leave further. My being at home helped Gladys a lot, for I was able to forage for fuel in the snow and ice. There was still considerable food rationing problems and I was also able to queue to get extras as well. Eventually, the weather improved and I returned to Markham after 3 weeks leave. One of the difficulties of married life in the R.A.A.F at this time was the hopeless accommodation shortage. There were only a handful of married quarters on base and those were taken by senior and longer serving officers. In remote and sparsely populated areas like Marham there was hardly any rented accommodation to be had locally. Having Gladys in London meant that at least I could see her at weekends. Eventually, however, we did manage to get to stay in the local pub for a few weeks and then afterwards we were able to rent somewhere to stay more permanently. We shared with the owners and another R.A.F couple, accommodation at a farm 6 miles from Marham. The farm was owned by a Baroness von R.A.A.F of Austrian extraction, but lived overseas. Her son Ernest lived at the farm from time to time but, for the most of the time the other pilot and our wives had it to ourselves. That was a lovely spot and we enjoyed it immensely, for we also had the run of the farm and got various goodies such as extra milk, butter and eggs above the normal rations. We were also allowed to shoot rabbits for the pot and they were there in their hundreds. It was now summer and we were enjoying a lovely spell of weather and life was good. Taffy Eccleston the other pilot and his wife Edith and Gladys and I all got on well together. He had been with me on 218 Squadron and we were also at Feltwell at the same time, although he was with another unit. His wife had been a WAF sergeant in air traffic control at Feltwell when they met. This happy situation went along merrily, and Taffy and I flew together as often as we could as it worked out as a good arrangement domestically. One amusing incident occurred after I had flown an Anson up to Kinloss in the north of Scotland to pick up fresh salmon for the annual ball. The smell of the fish pervaded the aircraft for days, but the crunch came when I was called upon to fly the Commander-in-Chief Bomber Command, Air Marshal Sir Hugh Sanders from Marham to Mildenhall. There was a frantic effort to get the smell of fresh from the aircraft, using every spray we could muster. Fortunately, the Air Marshal made no comment and all went well. We had expected some rather awkward questions as to what we were doing carrying the fish around. It was at Marham that I first flew with the then squadron leader Geoffrey Denin, a medical officer who was also a pilot, specializing in aviation medicine. I converted Geoffrey onto the Oxford. This was to be the forerunner of a lasting relationship for he became one of the leading lights in the radiology field, and we met up later on the British nuclear tests in 1957. Later still he became Air Marshal Sir Geoffrey Denin, Director General of R.A.A.F Medical Services. Another personality I flew at Marham was Mr. Russell, the chief designer of the Bristol Aircraft Company and designer of the Brabazon aircraft. I could have happily stayed at Marham for a lot longer, but it all ended rather suddenly. Freddie Ramsey, whom I had ranged with in the Mosquito, had volunteered for an instructor's course. Just prior to his posting his little daughter was tragically drowned in a stream at the bottom of their garden. He was taken off the posting to be with his stricken wife, and quite rightly so. HQ Bomber Command agreed and that appeared to be that. It was 7 days to the start of the course Freddie was supposed to be going on. Air Ministry called for a volunteer replacement, but none of us at Marham were interested. 3 days went by and then Air Ministry insisted on a replacement being named. As I had been on BDU and CBE longer than anyone else I was told I had to go, despite my protestations. After all I had only just been able to get accommodation for my family over the past 3 months, so I certainly did not want to move now. Air Ministry finally ruled that I had to go and that was that. I now had 2 days notice to report to the Central Flying School at R.A.F Little Rissington in Gloucestershire. There was not even time to move Gladys back to Wales, so she had to stay in Norfolk until I could get a few days leave from the course and move her to Carnarvon. It was an extremely disgruntled officer who reported to CFS and I told them I did not want to be on the course. At that time I had no desire whatsoever to become flying instructor. A way out seemed to appear rather unexpectedly. The first meeting of the course there was a cocktail party for us to meet our fellow students and the staff. Attending the party was Assistant Chief of Air Staff in charge of training, 1 Air Vice Marshal Basil Embry, a very famous Air Force officer, with 3 DSOs and 3 DFCs, who had escaped after being shot down over France. He addressed the course and told us that they wanted volunteers and that anyone who did not want to be an instructor should report the fact to the CFS staff the next day. I was encouraged by this comment and accordingly spoke to my flight commander the next morning. He passed my request to the chief instructor, Wing Commander Ben Bolt, who called me into his office for an interview. Meanwhile, I contacted a former flight commander from 218 Squadron, who was now in charge of postings at Bomber Command headquarters. He told me that if I got off the course he could have me posted back to CBE at Marham. Feeling quite pleased, I went for the interview with the chief instructor. He had other ideas, and when I referred to the comment by Air Vice Marshal Embry, he came back very positively. I quote him as follows: "I don't give a what the Air Vice Marshal said. You baits are on this course and you are bloody well staying on it," unquote. The course began and with me definitely on it. We were to do the usual mix of ground lectures and flying alternatively. One compensating factor was that the flight commander and my instructor, Flight Lieutenant Eddie Connor, were decent chaps and understood my predicament. The main part of our training as instructors were to be on Harvard and Tiger Moth aircraft. To add to my woes, another domestic problem arose. At the time, a very dangerous criminal had escaped in the Norfolk area and was thought to be on the loose in the King's Lynn region. He was a Polish commando who was known as the Blinking-Eyed Pole. All residents were warned over the radio that he was desperate and might try to steal food. One night Gladys awoke to hear a movement in the ivy by her bedroom window on the first floor. A face appeared at the window. Initially she froze and was speechless, but then she had the presence of mind to call out my name as though I were present. There was a sound of this character dropping to the ground and running off. She had an awful scare, and when I phoned her that night I was very concerned for her having to sleep alone, apart from little Valerie alongside. I managed to get a few days leave and went to Norfolk to sort things out, and over the next few nights, Taffy Eccleston and I kept shotguns handy. Eventually, the pole was recaptured and we all slept easier. Shortly after this episode I got time to fetch Gladys and Valerie and bring them to Little Rissington. We stayed at a guest house in Boughton-on-the-Water, one of the most lovely villages in England. I then got mid-course leave, and took Gladys home to Carnarvon. The course was going along reasonably well and I was getting on with it despite my previous objections. After all, I was hoping to be a full career officer and had to accept what I was ordered to do. We flew Harvards for about 50 hours and Tiger Moths for about 25. Once we reached the more advanced stage of the course we were able to fly several operational aircraft to gain a wider experience. As a result I was able to fly a Spitfire and a Vampire jet for the first time. Both these conversions were interesting in that there were no dual models of either aircraft at the time. After my experience in the Mosquito I had some doubt about this introduction to two more types of so different aircraft to what I had flown before. The system was that we received a detailed brief on the aircraft on the ground by an instructor and then we went ahead solo. In the event I had no undue difficulty with the Spitfire, a Mark X V1 and a delight to fly. Despite my objections I think the flying at CFS had improved my flying techniques and I was more prepared for flying different types. The flight on my first jet, the Vampire, was also a great thrill, as the aircraft had only recently come into service. My first solo was marked by a bit of drama, because on returning to the circuit after 20 minutes, I could not get the undercarriage to lower. I spent an anxious 10 minutes before I succeeded in getting it down and landing safely. In those days jets had a very short endurance and one could only stay up in a Vampire about 45 minutes, so there was not much time to sort out undercarriage problems. Whilst going through this last phase I also did a proper conversion onto the Mosquito, this time without incident. I also did some flying in a Lancaster with an instructor, who obviously knew a lot less about the Lang than I did. His lack of experience on this type showed up when he made a real mess of a bad weather approach and in the end I took over, much to his embarrassment. After we landed he was quite decent about it and made a comment that had some outcome later. He complimented me on how well I flew the Lancaster. We were getting near to receiving news of our posting on completion of the course. The policy on postings, at this stage, was that officers should be posted to a different command and this would mean that I could not go back to Bomber Command. I expected therefore to go to training command to teach new pilots to fly at ab initio level. There was, fortunately, a turn of events that went in my favor. One of the students on the course was going to be posted to R.A.F. Kinloss, a coastal command station in the north of Scotland where he would be training pilots on Lancasters. After the war, Coastal Command re-equipped with Lancasters, modified for the maritime reconnaissance role, and Kinloss was an operational conversion unit, where trained pilots did their conversion on Lancs, before going to Coastal Command. The student due to go there had failed his Lancaster conversion at CFS and his posting was cancelled, thereby calling for a replacement instructor. I had shown that if there was one thing I could do, it was to fly Lancs, and I was nominated in his place, a move which delighted me. Although I was not going to go to Bomber Command, at least I was to be able to instruct in an aircraft in which I was completely confident and happy to fly. The course came to an end on the 14th of January, none too soon so far as I was concerned, for generally it had been an unsettled period for me and my family. Over the past 2 years I had enjoyed a period of varied and interesting flying at Marham, a settling down to peacetime Air Force life, albeit it married by continued separations from my family. I now could look forward to a settled posting where I could get my family to join me and to fly an aircraft I loved flying. CFS had been a move not of my choosing, but, on reflection, it had done my flying a lot of good. When you have to instruct others, you must fly accurately, for it is no good telling a pupil to fly at certain heights, speeds and to a certain technique if you don't demonstrate these qualities yourself. A further benefit had been that I had gone through a course which had given me a much better grounding and basic technical knowledge of aviation and aircraft theory than it had been possible to have in the rush of wartime training. The CFS course had comprised a cross-section of interesting students, including those from the Royal Navy, Fleet Air Arm and Overseas Air Forces, including the recently formed Indian and Pakistan Air Forces. One amusing feature of the course was that I became very friendly with another chap, Jeff Catling, who had started his Air Force career as an aircraft engineer. I was pretty dumb in the technical field and he gave me lots of private tuition to help me get through engine exams. He had argued quite a lot with the lecturer in engine theory, and when it came to the oral examination he once again argued with him. To everyone's amusement, knowing how I had been tutored by Jeff, the results came out and I got a higher mark when he did. We all had a good laugh over the outcome. Jeff was also to go to Kinloss, for he had a coastal background and would be a good help to me to get settled in the new role. I set off quite happily for a short stay in London with my folks and then off to Wales on leave. Whilst at Marham I had bought my first car for £40 from a R.A.F officer. It was a 1931 Morris Minor 2-seater sports car, and despite needing quite a lot of attention, it was a good buy. With the help of a few tradesmen I got the engine overhauled and a new canvas hood fitted, the latter in Air Force blue. No questions to be asked. Driving the car in midwinter in Britain was a rather Spartan affair, and I was about to travel from one end of Britain to the other, with a division to London and Wales. More on this epic in the next chapter.